Welcome everybody to our community check-in program that takes place every Friday at 5 p.m. We're sorry we're a little bit late. We had some technical difficulties, but we're happy to be here now. So today's a special community check-in. Today marks the 53rd anniversary of the Naksa, where Israel launched the Six-Day War and took control of parts of Palestine, which had failed to capture during 1948. And so modern occupation began. We still see the effects of this war until today through the invasive occupation of Palestinian lands, removal of Palestinians, and the removal of Palestinian self-determination. And it is more relevant today, more than ever before, with the threat of annexing parts of the West Bank. The day came and the day should come that we no longer see injustice and oppression, and that becomes a fate memory. Palestinians deserve the right to freedom and self-determination. Given the current events and all that is happening to our Black brothers and sisters in the U.S., and in consistency with remembering the Naksa, the Palestinian American Community Center stands in solidarity with Black Americans and demands an immediate end to police violence in minority communities across the country. We demand justice for George Floyd and demand the law enforcement officers are held accountable each and every time they steal a Black life. Oftentimes, people explain that there is no place for racism in the U.S. Unfortunately, that's not true. Though there should not be a place for it, the reality is racism is ingrained in the very foundations of American institutions. We need to fight for change. We need to support the Black communities in this fight against state-sanctioned violence. To be silent is to be complicit. Black life matters today, tomorrow, and always. So now the question comes, as always, is how can we make a difference? What can we do? There are a few things that we outline and we encourage you all to take part of. The first is listen to Black community organizers. Stand in solidarity with Black community organizers and take action. Find your local rally, find different ways that you can support, whether it be physically or online. The second is identify that racism is everywhere. Whether you experience it or not, do not limit these conversations to how racism impacts the American criminal justice system. Make sure to discuss how racism impacts education, economy, and society as a whole. Third is have conversations with your white passing friends and our families about racism. Challenge yourself and try to see what are some racist tendencies that you may be engaging in without even intentionally intending to do it. And teach your children about racism. Number 4, stay educated on the issues and read about the history of racism in the US and all around the world. There are plenty of books that are being circulated, plenty of documentaries and movies that are being circulated, and we highly encourage that everybody takes the time, especially while being at home, and educates themselves about these issues and about racism. You can also donate. There are many different organizations that you can donate to. To list a few, there's the National Bail Fund Network. There's also the Minnesota Freedom Fund, the Louisville Community Bail Fund, and the and support Atlanta protests. The next thing we also recommend is demand justice and hold police officers accountable for murder. Contact your local government officials, sign petitions, use your voice, call the numbers that you need to call, make sure that this is heard. And lastly, say their names and never forget. There are too many, this has gone on for too long and we need to put an end to it. And hopefully together we'll be there to see a better future. And now I want to introduce Abira Sabah, who is the program director at the University of California, Santa Barbara Multicultural Center. Abir has also worked with PAC to implement education programs about solidarity. Abir will be discussing further the parallels between both struggles against oppression and what we can do to make a difference. Without further ado, Abir.
Thank you, Rania. I want to just start off with a couple grounding things first. I want to again thank Rania for trusting me again with coming into y'all's space, even if it's virtually, and allowing me to share some of the things that I know that I've picked up. But we are all always learning and growing together. I by no means want to claim to be an expert on anything. I have just read a lot and learned a lot, and that is knowledge that we continue sharing with everybody. I also want to start off by acknowledging the indigenous and stolen land that this whole country is on. In Santa Barbara, the native tribe is the Chumash tribe, and I always acknowledge and honor them before I start anything. In Clifton, I think it's the Lenape tribe, so I encourage you all to also always be centering conversations about indigenous struggle and resistance, because there is a huge link to that, to Palestine and to Palestine and the struggle always. And I also want to just take a moment to acknowledge that it's been a tough week. It's been a tough 72 years for Palestinians. It's been a tough 400 plus years for Black communities and people in the US specifically and globally. It's been a tough year. And so I just kind of want us to also just take a moment and acknowledge that, and that it is okay, and that everything we are talking about and wanting to discuss is also in that context, and that we are gentle with each other a little bit too, but we also continue to motivate each other and push each other to do as much as we can, especially now that the moment is calling us to. We are witnessing a true revolutionary force that's being led by the Black radical tradition and Black communities, and it's our duty and responsibility to follow. I have learned a lot from the Black radical tradition in the context of all of my work and activism for and on Palestine, whether my scholarly work or on the ground activism as well. And so I want to start us off with that, and I want us to just start off with understanding the Naksa. Right, so today, June 5th, today marks the 53rd anniversary of the Naksa, which took place June 5th, 1967. And I think and this is important today, every day, today, and especially this week, given what's going on this year, all that's going on, for many reasons. And I want to make it pretty clear and just really want to lay out that we recognize the Naksa for political reasons, not necessarily for cultural reasons per se on either side. But I want to make clear I'm really talking about this in a political understanding. The Naksa really gives us a political understanding of Israeli settler colonialism, of Israeli rule and oppression. So it's an anniversary that reminds us to condemn genocide, displacement, colonialism, forced exile, and recognize and forced exile. And what it really did, what the Naksa really did, is that it recognized and legitimized Zionism, right, as the violent political project that it still is today. So I think that's what we really need to understand of, like, why is the Naksa specifically important? What does the Naksa remind us? It's really what legitimized not just Israeli, rule or Israel coming in, but Zionism itself, the ideology as a political project, right? That is still existing, that is still being allowed to take place right now. And we all know this, we speak Arabic, you know this, hopefully, but the Naksa means a setback, right? It means a defeat. And so we have to understand what was the defeat, what was the setback. And so if we contextualize the Naksa within larger Palestinian history, really the Naksa is a continuation of the Nakba, right? It's a continuation of 48. And that's why I started off with, I want to distinguish the Naksa as the political reason. That's why it's a political statement to recognize it. 48 can also be a cultural, right? There was a cultural displacement, a cultural taking away, but the Naksa is really the deeper political Zionist project really being implemented and legitimized. That's really that word I think is most important. So it was the continuation of 48, which was the first initial displacement of Palestinian people and homes and culture. And what happened in, what was the Naksa, it's known also as the 6-Day War, was the Arab countries tried to retaliate against Israeli forces and its Western allies, right? The Western allies were empowering Israeli forces. It was not just, and this is what is not shown in history for very strategic reasons, right? It wasn't just Israel was so great and had, it rightfully won, quote, won against the six Arab, against the Arab countries that were trying to fight against it. It's what we're not told, what we're not taught in history is that it had so many resources and so much empowerment by many Western allies. And that is the part that also makes it very political. That is the part that becomes the legitimization of Israeli rule and Zionism as an actual political project, because it also started having all this support. And that support and that allyship, their allyship, is also still what exists today. The Arab support and allyship many of us know is not necessarily there, but that Western link to understanding Israel as a Western power or country that Western allies could relate to, so whether people in Europe or the US wanted to start supporting because they saw each other they saw themselves amongst each other, right? They saw themselves as related. And that is really, I want to make sure we kind of emphasize that whenever we talk about the Naksa. So these Arab countries were defeated within 6 days. It took 6 days, and that's why it's called the 6-Day War. That's why many folks remember it like that. And in those 6 days, Israel seized the territories of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula. Right, so they took even more land. They were able to seize and annex even more of Palestinian land, and land that is not theirs. Right, so I want to that displacement and that taking over of land that is not yours is also really important for us to think about. How do we contextualize the Naksa of what's happening today, right? How can we understand it in correlation to other struggles that, we kind of see some parallels to? So whether we're talking about indigenous struggles of an outside power coming in and claiming superiority and therefore the right to the land that you have had, that is yours, right? Claiming that. So that's the link to indigenous struggles, but there's also really powerful links to the Black struggle historically and today, right? Black Palestinian, Afro-Arab solidarity, whatever we want to call it, has been happening historically, but more recently there are unique peaks, right? There have been unique peaks of it. So for example, 2014, Gaza-Ferguson solidarity, that was what I centered my thesis on. And right now it's happening again. And in my understanding, it's another peak of Black Palestinian solidarity. And so the Naksa and today, and us remembering today, is also us honoring and being a part of the struggle for the fight for justice for Black lives that we are seeing happen, not just nationally, but even globally. I hope, and I think that we all have seen, there's a lot of people in Palestine, Palestinians from Palestine right now sending out letters of support, petitions, and using art, right? There are so many people drawing and putting the name and the face of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, people in Palestine, on the border, in Syria, right? We're seeing it. It's not just national, it's a global kind of solidarity that we're seeing. But to take us back to the Naksa itself and what those correlations are, if you all are interested, Alex Lubin, who's an amazing author, wrote about Afro-Arab and the history of Afro-Arab solidarity and working together in his book, Geographies of Liberation. I would highly recommend reading it, especially right now. And it was a great way to really contextualize all that's going on. But in Geographies of Liberation, he reminds us of correlations between the 1960s uprisings in the US, right? What are called, quote, the race riots, and the Naksa. And so the timing, right? The 60s are such an important and unique decade in American civil rights history, whether the history is told right or not, right? So Malcolm X, the Black Panther Party, MLK, the race riots in LA, right? That is happening, and the Naksa is happening 1967. So we have to always remember those historical links, and us remembering the links is a direct defiance to the history that is kept from us. Because if we know that history, we become empowered, we start working together, and that is scary for the people in power right now, because that means we become more empowered and come many steps closer to our liberation. The 60s, so the timing of the Naksa, the race riots, the 60s really marked a turn into global movements, right? So at first, folks were kind of fighting, right? There's people fight in the Arab world. We're fighting for Palestine. We're dealing with Israeli force and power coming in. And in the U.S., the 60s are one of the most important decades of civil rights movements, of fighting against racism, segregation, fighting for Black justice, for Black liberation at the same time. And so there's also a lot happening in Latin America. There's a lot happening globally in the 60s. It's a really, really important decade, and Palestine was a part of that, right? And so the 60s, again, mark a turn to global movements to connect on similar issues and understand the systemic issues, the systems and structures in place that affect multiple communities no matter where in the world. And that system and structures start to become identified as the white supremacy that still exists, colonialism, European and US colonialism and settler colonialism that still exists today, racism, policing systems, the abuse of, we're starting to really question, what do we have military forces for and police forces for? And these are conversations that we are still having today. And what I want to continue taking from Alex Lubin's book, right, is that we start to see unfoldings of resistance against oppression in both places, in many different places around the world. And although distant from each other physically, right, although they weren't in the same place, they couldn't experience exactly the same thing, both were brought together through what we can understand as an imaginary of revolution and freedom from oppression. So more presently, right, transnational solidarity amongst both Palestinian Black communities, or what Lubin calls the Afro-Arab imaginary, is based on a political consciousness that recognized shared social conditions. And these shared social conditions that they are fighting against are mainly centered around neoliberalism, so right, questioning US or European or Western involvement in different parts of the world, racism, and heightened policing and securitization. So these are mechanisms of violent colonialism, policing, curfews, checkpoints, military forces going in, tanks, right? These things that we were seeing in the 60s, both in the US and in Palestine, we're still seeing right now, both in the US and Palestine and other places in the world, right? I was making a correlation of curfews. Where do we think the US gets the idea of curfews? Israel puts in curfews as a way of policing people's movement, right? Policing Palestinian people's right to their own land. And one of that way is their movement, free movement in their own land, checkpoints, prisons, right? There are so many literal direct correlations. The NYPD is trained by the IDF. So our policing systems, our heightened militarized policing systems are very correct, are linked. And these were the things that in the 60s and in this moment, that's why we call it a global movement and global understanding. That's what the 60s gave us. And that the Naksa is part of that history. We cannot forget that. We cannot allow that to be erased, even by some, the more quote progressive or liberal, whatever we want to call them, entities right now. We can maybe remember certain parts of history, but we have to make sure, it's our duty to make sure that the Naksa and Palestinian struggle is always understood and always put as a part of the global revolutionary turn that the 60s took. Because it is still a part of all that's going on today. And really just ending on, there's what happens is there's feelings that emphasize that even though both communities or circumstances are not exactly the same, the feelings of pain and trauma that come from oppression and domination are still the same. And these are what I call the global imaginaries of resistance, right? You don't have to be physically in the same place. You don't have to be physically or emotionally harmed in the same way, but the systems and structures doing the harm are very similar. And so our liberation and our resistance have to be similar and have to be intertwined for all of us to achieve liberation. And that is kind of what I wanted to share in terms of the importance of remembering the Naksa and how to contextualize it in what is happening right now. Rania, I hope that was good, and I think we can take some questions or comments from other folks too.
Yes, no, absolutely. That was great. So if anyone has any questions or comments, this is the time to ask them. I think it's ever important to remember, the similarities between the struggles. And at the end of the day, oppression is oppression. And obviously each struggle is different and unique. However, there are many similarities that bring us together and that bring, the different struggles. And it's a call for ending this injustice, no matter where and in what shape it takes form, whether it be here or abroad.
Yeah. If I can add, and I shared this on Monday too, but I think it's what I've been really realizing this week is that it's really important to understand that we're not always talking about a different community when we are talking about the Black community and struggle for Black lives. There are Black Arabs, there are Black Muslims, identity is not just this, just check boxes, right? And so we also really have to think about, it's not just about, okay, fighting for someone else's while I fight for mine. It is a part of our community. I think we really need to be remembering that and understanding that more and more now.
Absolutely. And I think the concept of intersectionality and understanding how there's different parts of your identity that may, overlap and may have an impact. And in the end of the day, even if there's no other way, we're all part of the human race, and that's what's most important. And so I don't think we have any questions at this time. So I will be transitioning into just reminding everybody about the rest of the series that we have coming up. And I want to sincerely thank Abir for her valuable insight. I'm hoping that this is really going to be taken as an opportunity to think and reflect what can you do to make a difference? It is something that happened 53 years ago, and we're still seeing the effects of it today in many, many ways. And the situation's becoming worse and worse with every passing day. So we need to really challenge ourselves and see what can we do. And that's part of, the whole point of PAC, is to find out what we can do together, individually and as a community. As part of our community check-in series, starting next week, we'll be launching different webinars about the legal implications of COVID. When this series first started, we really were trying to focus on trying to help our different community members in their ways that they need it. And so this series will cover topics from stimulus checks, filing for unemployment, and PPP loans, among many other topics. We're also going to be taking this opportunity to give you all a chance to ask your questions and answer any concerns or issues that you have. And if there are no questions, which I don't think there are, I just want to remind you all of a very, very relevant quote that we've been seeing everywhere that Martin Luther King Jr. said, which is, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And we really, really have to remember that and embody that. So with that, I again want to challenge you all to take a couple moments out of your day and really reflect on everything that's happening around the world, and what is your role in that, and what can you do to ensure a future without injustice and oppression. And I want to wish you all a great day, and remember, you are the difference in this world. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you all next week.